media is what's important for not only the American people, but citizens around the world, and speaking truth to power and empowering people whose voices have been stifled and not heard. So, supporting your journalism, newspaper, television, radio, independent, nonprofit newsroom, that's what's really important.
I'm Justin Silverman of the New England First Amendment Coalition. Today's program is brought to you in part by the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, which supports our First Amendment and Free Press program, which allows us to discuss ways that journalism plays a role in our democracy. I'm here today with Alison Bethel McKenzie, who's a former senior editor at the Boston Globe, former executive editor at SBJ National, and now with Report for America. Alison, thank you for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me. Happy Thursday.
To you too. Alison, last several months have been challenging for everybody, given the pandemic and the circumstances that it provided. But it seems like newsrooms particularly have been hard hit between layoffs and furloughs and various closings. And while that's been in the news recently, obviously the challenges to local news, predates, the pandemic. Can you give us a better overview of the state of local news and the challenges that it's currently facing?
Local news has been impacted greatly, particularly in the last several months with a recession and COVID-19 and a number of other issues, continued downsizing, layoffs. But of course, the downsizing, layoffs, change in how news organizations make their money has been going on for quite a while now. And it's resulted in the closing of many newspapers, TV stations, radio stations, or the consolidation of media organizations. And that has meant that many communities throughout the United States have been left with no news media at all, no radio, no television, no news reporter to report on what's happening in their communities. And as you can imagine, without local news coverage, we've seen a decline in voter participation. We've seen a decline in holding leaders accountable. And it bodes really poorly for democracy. News organizations, journalism, as you know, is one of the pillars that upholds democracy. And so when you have massive areas, each state in America has some county or some community that has absolutely no news coverage. And that is devastating.
For sure. And so maybe you can put it into, a more narrow context for us, because I think to those that don't work in newsrooms or who aren't involved in journalism circles like you and I are, it might be difficult to really understand, how that lack of local journalism is playing a role or now not playing a role in their life. We can talk about, these abstract what can seem like abstract things about the role journalism plays in democracy and how important it is to provide a check on government. But to your average citizen who no longer, has a specific, news program on TV, or whose local newspaper, just was closed, what is the real effect on them? Like, how does that change their lives?
Well, in New England, times are really bad for media. You've had like 15% of the news organizations close in Massachusetts alone. But what it means is if you live in a small community or even a big community, but particularly in rural areas or suburban areas, how do you know whether or not your school district is the school you want to send your preschooler to is licensed? How do you know if a certain business is operating on the up and up? These things are important for people when they're living their daily lives. And without that information, people are not able to make really good decisions.
So what can citizens do in this case? How can we support local journalists the work that they do, and to make sure that we don't have any more news deserts and that communities are getting the information that they need. What's the solution?
Well, we're asking that communities really support local journalism in a very real way. Newsrooms are looking at different ways of raising income to keep going. And that's everything from a small donation to crowdfunding to applying for grants. And we're asking if people believe in journalism and they believe in the First Amendment and they understand the importance of having news media, that they contribute, that they pay for online subscriptions, that they pay for real, what we call old fashioned door to door subscriptions, but that they support their media, they support their journalists. Journalists are regular people. They live in our communities. They care about the same things we care about. In today's world, we're hearing constantly that media is the enemy of the American people. But we argue that media is what's important for not only the American people, but citizens around the world, and speaking truth to power and empowering people whose voices have been stifled and not heard. So supporting your journalism, newspaper, television, radio, independent, nonprofit newsroom, that's what's really important.
So maybe we can talk about that a little bit more, because I can already hear some people listening to what you're saying and responding by saying, oh, it's media, fake news, all media is the same. Why should I support media, as if all media is the same, right? It's not. There are differences between national media and political commentary.
That's right.
And local journalism that is tasked with covering specific communities. Can you maybe make that distinction a little bit more clear for us?
Absolutely. Research shows that most people who say they dislike the media are talking about the big media, and mostly television. So they're pointing to like CNN, Fox News, maybe the New York Times. They're pointing to these big media organizations. But when you ask them about their local newspaper, they're like, oh no, I remember Johnny when he used to deliver the newspaper, and now he's the managing editor of the paper. And they turn to their local paper for wedding announcements, obituary announcements, to read about, all sorts of the new ice cream parlor that popped up. There is a big difference between commentary that's part of media and reported stories that you find on the front page or the metro section or the business section. We used to have, back in the old days, and I don't know if you remember this, newspapers and education. And as part of that, we would learn, what is a lead story? How did they choose these stories for the front page? Why do they have so many sections in the front page? And really learn a little bit more about how newsrooms operate. We don't really have that sort of media literacy to the extent that we used to anymore. There are organizations like yours and others who believe that it's really important to educate community members, your average person, about the role of the media, how stories are decided, what process a reporter goes through to report stories. I guarantee people who watch this, I guarantee that the vast majority of journalists do not get up every morning and say, let me think what fake news I can write today. Not at all. People get into this business because they want to tell the stories of communities, because they want to make a difference, because they want to empower communities. They want to explain issues to communities. So there is a very big difference between commentary and news. I will say that the lines have been muddied a little over the last decade, with some, particularly broadcasters, giving maybe more of the opinion than they have in the past or have been allowed to do in the past. But there is a very distinct difference between the commentating and what the well-reported story.
So I think back to my own days as a journalism student, and then years after college working as a reporter, and always had the mindset, and always, was taught in school, you got to stay away from the story, be the passive witness, cover the community, but at a distance. I wonder now if you think there's more of an obligation on behalf of journalists to get out into the communities and explain how they do their job, why they're doing their job, and to really try to make up for that lack of media literacy that we've been seeing throughout the country.
No, absolutely. I think there's a great need for that. And I think that's why the Society of Professional Journalists Foundation, well ahead of their time, decided to create the Journalists on Call position that SPJ currently has. That person is charged with sort of dropping into communities across the country to talk about the role of journalism and to talk about what journalists do and to sort of hold these sometimes really difficult conversations about journalism and people's fears sometimes distrust, dislike of the media, why they feel that way. Sometimes it's simply just not knowing the process and what's happening. Here at Report for America, our core members, we call our journalist core members because we view journalism as a service to people. So it's modeled after Teach for America, AmeriCorps, Peace Corps, and that line. So our journalists do service projects within their communities. So they work with youth to produce some sort of media, be it podcast, video, a television spot, a newspaper, newsletter, so that students understand the power of journalism, the power of their own voice, how to listen to different opinions, how to talk about issues that concern them. For many of them, it's the first time they've ever met a journalist in person. So we hope that this act of service will also help to inform young people about what journalists do and the importance of journalism in our society.
Absolutely. And ultimately, I think the goal is to help build trust and to make sure that there's a mutual respect between those journalists and the communities they cover. We have a similar program with NEFAC in which we bring journalists out in the communities. And it's just amazing to see individuals from various communities reach out and personally meet and introduce themselves to the very journalists that are writing stories that they're reading, and to see them have a one-on-one conversation about coverage and to just talk about the state of journalism and how particular newsrooms could do a better job covering those communities, and likewise how citizens can have a better understanding of how that coverage works, as well as like you said, working with students and starting with younger individuals and really imparting on them the value of journalism. So we began this conversation talking about a lot of the financial difficulties that these local newsrooms are having right now. Can you tell me a little bit more about Report for America, your work, and the assistance you're able to give local newsrooms like those here in New England in the coming years?
We're so excited that we currently have about a half dozen partner newsrooms in New England that we work with who have reporters who've been assigned to them, or they've chosen, hired, employed, because we make recommendations of a slate of candidates who come to us, emerging journalists, and they choose the journalists who best fits their needs for the beat that they want to cover. We pay half of or a portion of the journalist's salary up to $20,000 for the journalist to work there, and the newsroom's responsible for the other half of the salary. So typically they will fundraise for 25% of that 50%, and then ask for community support for the other 25% to make 100% of the salary for the reporter. The newsrooms come to us and propose that reporters cover issues or communities that have been undercovered or underserved, or in some cases, never covered by their news organization or any other news organization in the region. And so these reporters are really handling new beats. They're going to communities that have not been represented on television, radio, newspaper before. Sometimes it's really hard because the community's like, what are you doing here? And we've never had a reporter that's cared about, our dog park being torn down or whatever. So it's good. It's exciting. We're really excited about the work we're doing. We're excited to welcome aboard new news organizations from New England, from the New England region. We have just opened up the application process for newsrooms. With our assistance, the newsrooms are able to hire reporters that they wouldn't normally be able to hire.
And these local newsrooms that are looking for support and want to get involved in the program, you said there's an application process that just opened. What's the first step? Where do they go, and how do they apply?
They should go to Report for America, FORamerica.org. And right on the landing page, you'll see the application process.
Alison, thank you so much for the work you do and taking time today to talk about these really important issues about local journalism and what we can do to make sure that newsrooms throughout the region and the country get the help they need. Thank you.
Thank you.